Hey everyone, this is Mello Santani from Analgesic Productions, and with the way that other social media platforms are going, I thought that it might be good to try this new kind of like devlog format that I see has become kind of popular. That's more of like a podcast style, where I kind of just talk into the camera. So if you don't know who I am, I'm Mello Santani. I'm half of Analgesic Productions, and I've been making games for about 12 or 13 years. Including the Anodyne series, which has picked up some award nominations, and other kind of like cult classic-y games like Symphony or even The Ocean. And most recently, we're working on this game, Angeline Era, which is what this video is a devlog of. And if you don't know what Angeline Era is, let me go ahead and show you a little bit of the trailer. So if you notice what's going on in this is that, let me lower the volume. Actually, when you're attacking in this trailer, it says bump the world. You're actually walking into enemies directly and attacking without pressing any buttons. Which means that you don't have to press a button to attack. And so it kind of like changes the whole way the game feels. And the way the levels are designed in this game are there are all these different rooms that are kind of like you play through them in an order. So a little bit like maybe a Mega Man or like a linear kind of action game. But you access all of these levels through an overworld where you can explore, and none of the level entrances are shown from the beginning, but you have to kind of search suspicious spots of the world map and kind of open up different levels. So that's the gist of the game, and I wanted to talk about how did we come up with this 3D combat system. So if you're making games and you've wanted to kind of like get into making action games, I think this would really help because there's a lot of advice out there that's a little bit weird. So the first thing I would recommend is that actually I've written a lot of these ideas on my Substack blog, so you can read that in the description. But I'm going to go through some of the ideas that I talk about in these blogs. So the very first one is moveset prototyping. So what does this mean, right? This means that it's essentially just testing out the verbs of your game, you know, like jumping or like countering or ground pounding. In our case, this game actually started out as Anodyne 3, which if you don't know is kind of this mix between experimental adventure and like traditional Zelda-like, and a lot more if you've played. So we started from that base and tried to apply it in 3D. And to do that, you know, the weapon is a broom, so we had an attack button for slashing, just a very simple attack. There's a few other ideas like a gun. I don't know if you saw in the trailer, but you can actually shoot. And so we played around with having a button that you could hold to shoot, and you could aim the reticle of the button around the screen to aim where you want to shoot. We also had a spin move, which is kind of like a weird way of countering bullets. And you know, you could run around and jump in 3D. So it was very, you know, it's very easy to make these moves in a couple of days, but you can't really have a sense of how well they're working unless you are creating enemies with it, right? Because if you're making an action game, action games are not just movesets, but they're about the kinds of hazards, kind of pressures you engage with enemies, or hazards, or just like the physical environment of a level in general. And the way that all of those things put pressure on you as a player kind of creates the action. So, you know, after we make some of these initial moveset ideas, and you know, some of those come from inspiration from other action games we've played. For example, the aim shot comes from the Super Nintendo Wild Guns games. Oh, Wild Guns. After we do that, you know, you want to make some enemies. So we made, you know, your simple like slime that just walks around. We made a flying enemy that kind of like swoops at you like a bat. Some ranged enemies that fire bullets at you. We made enemies like turtles that you could flip over to attack with the ground pound. We had like a weird stagger system where you could like do certain moves to put enemies into weak positions. You know, a lot of scattered ideas that are not all created equal. And after making these enemies, you know, that allows us to make really simple levels. So I made some test levels where I, you know, created a couple of rooms, one after another, each with different enemies. And I would play through that. Marina, the other development partner on Angeline Era, she would also play through that. Sometimes we would have friends play through it and see what they thought, see what they found difficult. And we would learn, you know, what aspects of this moveset that we made are unnecessary or too complicated. And, you know, over a period of some months, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on in making the game. We realized that, you know, the ground pound doesn't really make sense. This like spin counter doesn't really make sense. There used to be this like sliding move that didn't really make sense. And aiming the gun, that also didn't really work very well with the flow of the game. You know, standing to aim kind of felt in conflict with moving around very quickly and like attacking the enemies. But perhaps the most important thing that we got out of this was that when you're playing these action games a lot, but perhaps the most important thing that we got out of this period was the bump slash idea, right? Which is the main thing that we showed in the trailer. And where that kind of came from was being, you know, RSI, repetitive strain injury. If you press buttons a lot when you're playing games, that often leads you to, you know, have a sore wrist afterwards. So we were thinking about ways of how do you make an action game where it's a lot faster to kind of like fight things, basically. And we came up with the idea, borrowing this kind of from the East series, the YS series, of being able to attack without pressing any buttons. And what this actually led to was a combat system where, you know, you're able to sort of do a lot by just moving around and jumping and shooting, not having to press any buttons or combos. It creates this very fast-paced system where you're always kind of forced to go close to the enemies to fight. And that opened up just a lot of level design and interaction ideas, not just for combat levels, but also for building the world, you know, being able to bump into treasure boxes to open them or bump into characters to talk to them. And to kind of confirm, you know, even after we find the bump slash idea, it doesn't really mean that everything's kind of done with the game, right? You know, we still have to figure out the level design style. But, you know, once we settled on this kind of bump slash idea with the enemies within these rooms, that allowed me to kind of make a bunch of levels and test them out and get a sense for things like, oh, you know, how long should an action level be? What kind of like arc of difficulty should be in them? How many different enemies or different types of enemy combinations are required to give a level an identity? What kind of level structures should there be? So many levels in Angeline Era end up being linear, but we played with kind of like Zelda dungeon-y style levels that didn't quite always work for the most part. But by making lots of levels and by playtesting these levels, so, you know, we brought the game to some shows, I did some playtests with friends. We also did, you know, beta tests. That allows us to see that, okay, this kind of difficulty or this approach to level design will work. So for example, in Angeline Era, you used to have to kill every single enemy in a room to open up the gate to go to the next room. But actually, in the final game, you only have to kill a subset of all the enemies in a room to proceed. And what this does is it creates a sort of kind of like familiarity slash puzzle logic to every single action room in the game, where if you've been somewhere before, you might be able to sense this idea that you only have to kill these certain enemies to open the door. And that lets you kind of strategize and optimize even after you've died a few times in the level. Uh, Additionally, the advantage of not having to kill every enemy in a level to open the door is that the pacing is a lot better. So in this game, it's kind of like when there's too few enemies in the room, the game becomes a little bit too easy and straightforward. The combat shines the most when there's multiple hazards mixing together. So this kind of like partial gate unlocking thing is what makes the game kind of shine on a room level, on like a room scale. So with that in mind, I was able to figure out things like, okay, if a level has like 10 combat rooms in it, that's a little bit too long because of the way the health system works. You can't heal you can't choose when you want to heal. You only get to start with HP at the start of a level, unless you're lucky enough to find some health drops from enemies. It also, when you kind of know, oh, I only can work with maybe like 6 to 8 room ideas for a action level, you kind of get an idea for what kind of shapes can I make. And that's important, or what kind of overall shapes of the levels can I make. And that's important because these levels are ultimately what are building the entire world of the game. So if I'm working in an area that is like set in a forest or set in a canyon, then I need to know how can I express a forest or express a canyon through this palette or through this scope of about 6 to 8 rooms. And it's not always 6 to 8 rooms, but by starting there, I'm able to kind of know kind of like how much clay I'm working with, like so to speak. Right. So that's just some general advice from making Angeline era. There's all sorts of action games, but I really like these kinds of games that are not heavy on memorization. They're actually a little bit generous in some ways, where you can react to a lot of things. I like games where you don't really have to like memorize specific patterns of enemies, and it's not about like doing very specific moves in certain orders. It's more about kind of like building your confidence over a whole level so that you minimize your mistakes. Right, and then a last note, playing other action games has been really useful for me, especially like Ys, and playing these action games on harder difficulties is really useful because when you design an action game level, actually you want to be sort of designing it to be as hard as you can handle at first. And then from there you can kind of like refine each idea of the level. So by that I mean, in Angeline era, you might have a level with like, say I put like 4 of those goats in there and like 3 of those bullet shooters. And that's like way too much going on, right? But I can play through that and I can survive through that, but I realize, because I played so much of Angeline era on a hard difficulty and I played other games at hard difficulties, I can get a sense for like, well, I can condense this idea down to just, a few of these goat chargers and a few of these shooters, and it will still express kind of the same kind of like pressure on the player without being totally overwhelming. And so the importance of, if you're making an action game, the importance of playing other action games on hard is that you're able to get, by not having as much wiggle room, you're able to really get a sense of what the level designers are going for. And that is useful for when you come to make a level yourself and, you want to figure out how can I condense these ideas to still be expressive. So, express certain kinds of pressure on the player without being like totally incoherent, right? Because you could make a game hard by just dumping a bunch of enemies just randomly. But that isn't as good for kind of like world building and kind of giving a sense of personality to each level. Lastly, something that was useful, and this was more recent this year, was actually playing some arcade games. So some shmups, beat 'em ups, other kinds of arcade games. And playing these has been useful because a lot of these games are designed to make you play at a very high level, but also to try to score very high. And these two ideas, playing at a high level or like scoring really high, if you apply those to your own action game, and even if you don't have score, what it actually does is, you're kind of forced to decide what direction do I really want to push the combat and action of this game. And when you're aware of that idea, that allows you to make decisions, better decisions when you're designing levels, right? An obvious one would be, this is a game about playing well over multiple rooms. It's not about one really hard room. And so knowing that lets you kind of figure out the pacing of a level and so on. By looking at arcade games that kind of force people to play at a really high level, you're also able to just think about like, what are ways that I can take aspects of that kind of arcade style of difficulty design, but apply it to a different context. So playing these arcade games, which are designed to kind of have very memorable levels, I think you get a good sense of how to adapt that into an action adventure, which is more about exploring a world and playing levels one at a time. It is quite different from arcade design in that you don't have the kind of pressure an arcade game has, where as you get further into the game, the stakes are a lot higher. But I think it does kind of keep you wanting to design levels in a way where every idea kind of has a certain meaning to it. It's not kind of just like endless enemies one after another that aren't really doing much for expressing the world you're in. And arcade style design feels like a very pure version of like trying to build a world through these action interactions. And that's useful when you kind of go into an adventure game context like Angeline era, and you obviously, I can't make levels that are arcade levels for this game, but I can think about, now if I'm aware of the very extreme side of the spectrum of kind of like action level design, then I'm able to kind of adapt that for this different sort of context. And so I would summarize this whole point number 5 just as that if you experience a lot of extreme sides of game design, like arcade action or difficult modes on action games, that allows you to kind of just be aware of the sort of range that you have at your disposal when it comes time to kind of decide on your level design direction. And the last thing to remember is just that, you can't be perfect, right? Especially if you're kind of making a new kind of combat system, there's all sorts of things related to like level design, pacing, and ideas in Angeline era that I think could be improved on, especially with more passes through the design. But you kind of just have to call it quits at some point. For me personally, I'm a perfectionist in some ways, but when it comes to stuff like level design, I don't care that much. I mean, I care about the level design, but I don't need it to be like amazingly perfect and like all based around like genius ideas one after another going and going. The way I like to view it is more of like, okay, I proved out this combat system. I'm going to make these levels for it that I'm proud of and I think are entertaining and interesting. And I'll leave that for some other developer or some other generation of developers to pick up and explore. And by talking about my process doing this, hopefully that can help people figure out how to do it themselves if they want to. Yeah. So moving on, let's see here. Okay, let's just talk about a monthly update. Also, let me know if this is kind of like too long or something. I'm not sure. I get the sense that people listen to these in the background, so it's good to be a little bit longer. I think I'm about 20-ish minutes. So what is new in Angeline era in August? What happened last month? Well, the first thing is that we finished this very, very large level, which I can't tell you about. I mean, we've tweeted a little bit of it before, but it's a little bit unusual. It's not really like a lot of the other levels in the game. The gimmick of it is that you're kind of traveling from the surface of this level very, very far down, and you have to get to the bottom without dying. So it sounds like a roguelike, but it's not a roguelike. but it does play with some of those concepts, right? So there's an economy of like gaining money, but it's not, I don't know, unsatisfying in the way a lot of those run-based games are. For one, it's not procedurally generated. For two, it's very tied into the game's story and themes. There's a unique sense of humor to it. There's kind of this unique combat and like economy system that I think will be very memorable. Some great twists along the way. It's sort of like its own game on its own. I think it'll take most people about an hour or two to get through. It is required to beat the game, but there is a grinding aspect to it that you can use if you're having trouble. But just look forward to that when the game comes out next year. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm gonna like update this thing so it points to what I'm talking about. Okay, yeah. So the second thing is that the scale levels are all done. What are scale levels? Well, scale levels, they're called scale levels because when you beat, these are like linear action levels, sort of like the ones I was just talking about. And when you clear these levels, you gain this like glass scale, and these scales can be used to level up. However, there is a very early level cap to the game, so like I think by clearing about maybe like 30 to 40% of the levels, you'll hit the level cap. So you can't really grind your way to everything being easy. The level cap is just more there to create texture to exploring the game's world, rather than you can just run everywhere right away. So what I've been doing the past about 2.5 months was working on a lot of these scale levels as well as other types of levels that I won't talk about today. And a lot of these levels I did kind of like a rough draft of last year or earlier this year. And after we released this demo, the demo for the game in May, I got a lot of feedback. I was able to think a lot about the level design direction, and that allowed me to have a much stronger idea of how I want to revise and refine the ideas in these levels. Additionally, I was able to revise the levels knowing exactly where they would be in the world map and at what point they would occur in the pacing of the whole game. So basically, I was able to make stronger decisions. I'm very glad that this pass is over now because it was very tiring, although there's still quite a lot more to work on with the game. But with that out of the way, it's a big relief. Able to work on other stuff now. There were some cuts along the way, which is okay. I think, I think there's going to be about like, like 110, 120 levels. Half of those being scale levels, but I cut about 15% of them maybe, just to save time and sanity. I don't know. It just seems like too many, right? But that's okay. I mean, there's other things that I'm thinking of cutting. I don't know if we'll have to yet, but we'll look at the schedule because I'm aiming to have most of the stuff done by like March next year. Yeah, so we'll see. But in terms of the game itself, I'm not really worried about it getting done. It's just a matter of when will it get done, and I want it to be done earlier just for financial reasons. I also don't want to hit the summer window. I would love to launch before June. That's my goal. But we'll see. Third, last month, I added a lot of stores. So there's towns in the game where you can buy stuff from stores. That sounds very boring, but it is boring. Stores are boring, but I like to make stores fun. So a lot of the stores have fun little twists that I think you'll enjoy. Sometimes it is a normal store, but the location of that store is kind of funny or interesting. Sometimes the store has strange items for sale, or sometimes the items the store is selling are very related to the town you're in. There'll be some funny moments. I'm thinking about one right now, but I can't tell you yet. So just watch out for the store. Don't trust everyone you see. Bosses. We're pretty close to finishing all the bosses. I have about four bosses left, but two of them seem like they're going to be easier. So I finished another boss last month. The bosses are really exciting. Like if you play the demo, we have two of the bosses, but actually there's quite a few more in the final game. And I'm pretty proud of what we've done with the bosses. Like they all feel very unique, and none of them are those bad Nintendo bosses. None of them are bosses that require like hard memorization of anything. Really, it's just like a matter of kind of figuring out the pressures the bosses have and when your window of attack seems to be safe. I've always kind of wanted to operate under a design principle of like you can be as aggressive as you want, and I try to minimize any of that annoying shit that action games do where they're like, now you gotta wait and sit through this easy attack that you've already memorized how to dodge before you can attack again. I don't like that. I don't like when bosses feel kind of mathy or they feel too much like a single like sequence is playing out. You know, I hate multi-phase bosses unless, you know, there's something funny about it, like the fish boss. So I think you'll enjoy the bosses. Actually, I think it's pretty extraordinary what we've done with the design of them. Yeah, so I learned a lot from playing Ys on like hard levels. I actually think Ys Oath and Ys Origins bosses are not very good. Sorry, some of them are okay. They're fun, but I don't know. This is not the time to talk about that right now. But yeah, I wrote about it on like Backlogged or something. I don't know. Some of the bosses are good. I mean, they're all fun, but I have issues with it. But the point is that by playing those on a really high level, I was able to learn a lot about what I like and what I don't like. Let's go through these really fast. So next, overworld planning. Last month I did a lot of overworld organization. So I roughed out a few. So the game's overworld is split into kind of like 7 big maps. So if you play the demo, that's kind of like a small map. So imagine something like 1.5 to twice that size, and then multiply that by like 6.5, and that's about how big the game is. So I did a lot of work kind of like figuring out what size makes sense for that, roughing out the locations of every level, deciding kind of like where each level goes within each zone of the overworld and how that contributes to a certain kind of like vague story idea or theme. For instance, there's like early on near Dublin, there's like a farming area, and the areas around there are sort of like farm related. So it's kind of like that way, that organizational process, which I could talk about this at length, and I would like to after I've made more progress with the overworld. But just thinking about ways of how to organize the levels in ways that make sense. I also added mounts, which are things you can summon on the overworld to ride around it faster, just for fun. There's a few gags in there. Well, after that, let's see. Balancing. I thought about the game's balancing again. Kind of like the average number of hits you can take per level to get hurt. And I revised it a little bit. Earlier on, there was a much bigger difference between early levels and later levels in terms of like enemy stat scaling. So it felt like something like Elden Ring or like Dark Souls. But I didn't really like that. So how the game's kind of like stat curve is kind of like there's a pretty big difference between the opening area and like later areas, but it kind of like balances out pretty quickly. So the idea of it is that like after you get through the intro area, you can, if you're good, you can pretty much go to later game areas and explore those right away. If you're not as good, you might want to spend time might take your time a bit to fight through some more areas and get a little bit stronger. And I think it's a good balance between, you know, allowing you to overlevel too much and kind of like killing all the challenge and just being way too hard for everybody. So even if you max out your level, it's still not an easy game if you're playing on like the normal difficulty. I also went through and revised kind of like the average number of hits to die for each difficulty mode, and I made the game a little bit easier. I've been watching some other people play, and there's just, I don't know, there's just a wide range of ability with this kind of perspective, like top-down 3D. And I would like for more people to be able to play it, but I also want everyone to kind of be challenged a little bit. So, you know, that's why I'm not introducing difficulty options like invincibility, which is kind of counter to some ideas I've had in the past. But, you know, I believe that you can get through it through practice. And if big companies don't do it, why am I expected to do it, you know? So, 6, items spreadsheet. This is, I don't even know why I put this on here. This is pretty boring. Maybe it's not boring. You know, I have a giant spreadsheet of like every area in the game and what items are in them. And I also have a list of the items in the game and where they're found. And that's just to keep things organized because there's so much shit moving around this game. This game is too big. I don't want to make a game this big again for a while. But, you know, when you have 100 levels and you have all this like stuff scattered around it, you need to like, you gotta stay organized, basically. Okay, so those were the main things that happened last month. Last month was a bit busy because there's this other game I'm working on, Donchi Days, and I've been having to do some stuff with that to prepare for a secret, almost said it, that's happening in a week or two. I also open sourced Anodyne 2 for the anniversary. You can download Anodyne 2 if you played that and open it in Unity. Read through all the source code, whatever, use the models. I also released the second volume of After Journey's End, which is a journal by indie game developers writing about the design of their games. So I was happy to get another 8 or 9 people on board to write for that. So if you're curious to read about game design by game designers with a little bit of experience, please check that out. Otherwise, yeah, thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I could try to answer them next month. But yeah, please subscribe. Please share this with anyone who's interested in game design. I would like to have more actual game designers making videos about game design. And check out Angeline Era's demo. Check out Donchi Days, the other game I'm working on. I'll link those all below. And yeah, thanks you for listening.